It's about 10 seconds. Welcome everybody. I am Rob van Duin of the Office of Studium Generale, and Studium Generale organizes this special lecture tonight, the Dr. Jetans lecture, since I think about 32 years for the Maastricht University in honor of one of our founders of the university, Dr. Jetans. A very special welcome to the sons of Dr. Jetans, and of course to our committee of Studium Generale, our program committee, our foundation of Studium Generale, all other invitees, but especially of course all students and other people in the audience who are joining us here today, and not only in the hall, also online. So there's a live stream for those people who didn't get in because it was actually fully booked. Still some places left, I see, on the balcony. But anyway, I hope people at home are joining in too, or otherwise you can always watch it back if you missed something. So a recording will be available on our website of Studium Generale. The lecture will take about an hour, after which there is of course room for some questions and answers, and then we have some drinks to celebrate this special occasion. To introduce our lecture and also of course the speaker of tonight, I want to give the microphone to Jeroen van Velzen, who is here in name of the board of our university, and he's secretary of that board of the university. Jeroen van Velzen.
Thank you. I will keep it very short because David will have a much more interesting talk than I have. I'm here to welcome you all on behalf of Rianne Letcher, the president of Maastricht University, who is fortunately not able to be here tonight. But she asked me to welcome you and introduce David, who will talk about the strength and the weaknesses of democracy in those resting days that we are now in. I think it is a very interesting talk, especially for Tans' lecture, because Mr. Tans, Schenk Tans, was not only the president of the University of Maastricht, the first president of the University of Maastricht, but he was also very involved and a socialist member of the Partij van de Arbeid, and very involved in all aspects of democracy. So tonight we will listen to a speech of David Runciman, and I have a speaking note because I have to remember everything he does, and it's quite a lot. He is professor at the of political sciences at Cambridge University and fellow of the British Academy. In recent years he has taken us by hand and offered ideas to take a sharp look on our democracy and not simply regard it as untouchable. In our sister really midlife crisis, are we in danger of our liberal democracy politics growing and more slowly giving way to more authoritarian spots? I don't know, but David does. So maybe we would ask him to do the rest of the lecture. Please give a warm applause to David, please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me okay. It's a pleasure to be here and a great honor to have been asked to give this lecture. So I'm going to talk about, the title is Authoritarianism Winning? I think it's true, and I'm speaking for myself as much as anyone else, that we all have this tendency when we think about politics, when we analyze it, when we discuss it, to want to know who's winning and who's losing. We want to know the score. It's a kind of psychological impulse that we all have, and I think there are two basic reasons for that. The first one is that politics just is tribal. So as the American social psychologist Jonathan Haidt has said, your political affiliation, my political affiliation, has more in common with supporting a football team than it does with rational argument, philosophical discussion, moral sensibility, or even knowing the truth. He actually says religious affiliation is the same. And if you do support a football team, you will know that the only thing you really care about is the result. So if football fans sometimes say, I don't mind if my team wins as long as they play beautiful football, they don't mean it. You want to know whether your side has won. And then the second reason that we need to know the score in politics is because that's the way we break up political time. So political time flows through our lives, and we need these periodic moments where we hold what has happened to account. So we need units of account in time, so that we can say of a given period, was it worth it? Was it worth making that sacrifice? Did they deliver on what they said they would deliver? What is the net benefit of what we have done? And you can only ask and answer those questions if you have a point, which is a moment in time, where you take the score, you settle the account. And that means in our politics, I think we have two primary ways of thinking about how to answer the question as to whether or not our side has won. In democracies, one of those is elections. So I think we all are aware of this, that an extraordinary amount of political space and imagination is taken up in democratic societies thinking about elections, who will win, who will lose, and as soon as the election is over, we're thinking about the next one. It's an extraordinary volume of discourse and information relative to what are relatively brief events. Months, years, thinking about what will happen on a particular day, and as soon as it's done, we're on to the next one. So elections is one, and the other one is war. So war is the other way we decide who's winning and who's losing, because wars happen in time. I mean, they are temporally bounded events on the whole. On the whole, they have outcomes that can be analysed in terms of winning and losing. And they are incredibly important. It really matters. It's quite hard to come out of a war and not think it matters which side has won. So if you just take those two measures, our primary measures, elections and war, authoritarianism, as of now, is losing. So 2022 has been a bad year for the authoritarians. In electoral democratic terms, they keep losing. Le Pen lost in France. There was a moment when it looked like she might win. She didn't even come close. Bolsonaro has just lost in Brazil. And perhaps most significantly of all, Donald Trump has lost again for the third time in a row in the United States. So the United States midterm elections that happened a couple of weeks ago were being talked up as this great event that was going to herald perhaps the death of American democracy if Trump's candidates, who were the ones on the whole who followed him in denying the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election, were themselves elected, that would be another nail in the coffin of American democracy, and it didn't happen. American democracy is not, in those terms, dying. The Democrats, Joe Biden, did better than expected. They did better on the whole than incumbent presidents do 2 years into their first term. Biden did better than Obama. Biden did better than Clinton. In those terms, American democracy looks in surprisingly good health relative to the doomsters of a month ago. And Trump is in many ways the kind of poster child, and he is a child, the poster child for authoritarian politics, and his fortunes tend to be the ones that people track when they're trying to work out what's up and what's down, illiberal, authoritarian versions of democratic politics. And for now, that side is losing. And the authoritarians, or one authoritarian in particular, is also losing the single most important military conflict that's taking place in the world at the moment, which is the Ukraine war. So again, relative to where we were earlier this year, when Putin was about to invade, and there was an expectation that the Russian army and the Russian state would simply overwhelm the Ukrainians, what we have discovered is that that regime is much weaker than it looked. It's militarily much more incompetent than it appeared. And a lot of these things are connected to its authoritarian character. Authoritarian regimes on the whole are not good at fighting wars. They tend to be inefficient. Their armies often have these kind of Potemkin qualities to them. They look good on the outside, they crumble much more quickly. The bad news doesn't reach the top, so the person running the show doubles down on his mistakes, and it's almost always a him. And these things are being played out in the Ukrainian conflict. I don't know how it's going to end. I'll talk about that a bit later. I don't know if Ukraine will win, but I do know that as of today, Russia is losing. So my question, is authoritarianism winning? If you take our two main measures and you take what's happened in the last 12 months, the answer is no. Authoritarianism is losing. However, I'm afraid I don't think that's the right answer. And I don't think it's the right answer, and this is what I'm going to talk about in this lecture, because first, I think those are the wrong measures. We overstate the significance of those moments in time where we can say, after an election, at the outcome of a war, now we know who's on top. And secondly, because I think actually the challenges that we face do not fit this account of political time. I think we misunderstand how to think about time in politics if we break it up into these periodic moments of taking account and use that to orient our prospects for the future. So on the whole, the message I'm going to give today, if you are against authoritarianism, which I am, you may not be, but I am, on the whole, the message I'm going to give is broadly pessimistic, but I don't want you to think that it's entirely pessimistic, and at the end I want to come back to the strengths of democracy and try and frame what I'm saying in a way that doesn't make it look like what I've said is the answer is not, they're not winning, they are winning. It's more complicated than that. So first of all, I just want to explain why I think both elections and wars, and perhaps war is a more controversial claim, are not the best way to judge the strength of the long-term prospects of a political cause. So I think we overstate the importance of elections. They are clearly essential to the functioning of democratic politics, but what they are not good is markers of where we are going. So in real time as lived events, it's very hard to know which are the most significant elections. We often get it wrong. The ones that we think are most important, often with hindsight, turn out to be less important. And part of the reason for that is that we overstate their symbolic value. So we mistake the symbolism of an electoral outcome for the substance. And if you'll forgive me, I want to draw my examples from America because that's where these arguments tend to be most heated. So if you think about before Biden, the two presidencies that preceded his, Trump and then Obama. When Obama got elected, it seemed like an absolutely seismic moment in American politics. It was a moment of extraordinary hope for those on the broadly liberal side of American politics, but the symbolism was impossible to avoid. America had elected its first non-white president. It had not just done that, it had elected an extraordinarily eloquent, intelligent, sophisticated politician, probably the most intelligent person in terms of raw IQ to occupy that office, maybe in its history. Smart, eloquent, not white. The election of Donald Trump seemed like the diametrical opposite of that. So again, the symbolism was impossible to miss. America had gone from this extraordinarily hopeful moment, what looked like the vindication of democratic life. I mean, any political system that could produce such a man as its leader, to what looked like the kind of reduction to absurdity of democratic life, any political system that could produce such a man as its leader. Donald Trump is not the most intelligent person to occupy the White House. But that is to mistake what actually happened. So I would say, not just with the benefit of hindsight, but it could be seen at the time, Obama was not a change candidate. Obama was a continuity candidate, and Obama was a continuity president. Symbolically, he looked completely new, but in reality, he understood his political task to prop up and hold together the system that had come under enormous strain during the financial crisis, and to keep the show on the road. He was not a radical president, he was not a particularly reforming president, he was just a very competent version of the thing that had gone before. Donald Trump was potentially a radical president. He wanted to do things that very few presidents have thought was within their power to do, but he was completely incompetent. He didn't know how to work government at all. So what you got was a president who looked like he might represent a dramatic shift in American politics, but actually didn't. And one of the reasons that he didn't is he didn't know how to do politics because he's not a politician. So the first time that Donald Trump ever stood for public office was when he ran for president. in 2016. He's basically fought 4 elections. He won the first one somehow just, even though he lost the popular vote. And he's lost the next 3, the midterms, the presidential election, the midterms. He's no good at politics. And he doesn't understand how it works. He's amazingly good at symbolism. He's an extraordinary communicator. He's a genius in boiling down messages to their essence. He has no idea how to run a country. And he effectively did nothing except for getting 3 justices on the US Supreme Court. Those 3 justices were not Trumpish at all. They were the 3 justices that any Republican president who had won that election would have tried to put on the US Supreme Court. Trump claimed the credit for it. Anyone could have done it. So we mistake the symbolism for the reality. But the other thing is, elections are not like football matches. They are not the final whistle. The score is not the score. Each election result is just a staging post on the route to the next one. The election doesn't settle anything. It just sets the terms for the next contest. And when you think about it in those terms, it's not obvious that what looks like a victory is actually a victory. So you could read the US midterms that have just happened in this respect. Biden doing better than he did makes it more likely that Biden will run again in 2024. If Biden runs again in 2024, he might well lose because he will be too old to run for president. That means he could lose to Donald Trump, who is absolutely useless at politics. There are very few candidates who could lose to Donald Trump in 2024. Joe Biden is probably one of them. Or you could say that the result of those elections is that it's less likely that Trump will be the candidate and more likely that somebody like Ron DeSantis will be the candidate. Now, Ron DeSantis, depends how you want to understand his politics, is not in many respects as authoritarian, certainly not as willing to attack the core tenets of democracy as Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the man who in 2016, when asked, what will you do if you lose the election, says, I won't accept the result. He said it back then. And in 2016, when he was asked, what would you do if you were president about Hillary Clinton, said, I would jail her. So those are 2 litmus tests of authoritarianism. You don't accept the results of elections and you jail your political opponents. He was president, he didn't jail her because he has no idea how to do anything. But there is a view that a more competent politician, even if not at the extreme that Donald Trump represents, but embodying some of the values that he upholds, many of which may well in the long run be threatening to the stability of American democracy, is a much more dangerous proposition for the long-term health of American democracy than an symbolically extreme incompetent. What about a less symbolically extreme, less incompetent, who knows how to get things done? So you just don't know across time whether these markers actually tell you what you think they tell you, because the match is never over. That's the point about democratic politics. It just keeps going. The second thing I want to say, and perhaps this is more contentious, is I also think wars are a bad measure of the ultimate success or prospects of success of the causes for which they've been fought, particularly when that cause is democracy. And I just want to, this is pretty broad brush history, but I just want to put this in very general terms. I would say in the last 100 years, there have been 2 wars that were fought for and decisively won on the battlefield in the name of democracy. They were crusades for democracy, and democracy won them unequivocally. The first of these was the First World War. So the First World War, at its origin, was not at all a war for democracy, because Britain and France were fighting on the same side as Russia, which was a Tsarist autocracy. But when Russia dropped out of the war after the Bolshevik Revolution, and America joined the war in 1917, suddenly, for a year, this war was an explicit crusade to make the world safe for democracy. And that side won, clearly, unequivocally. The autocratic regimes of Central Europe collapsed. Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Bolsheviks surrendered. So the Bolsheviks also lost the First World War. They just got out, leaving the victors, United States, France, and Britain. All of them by that point, not quite by our standards, but certainly by their standards, democratic states fighting a democratic war in the name of democracy and winning it, leading to euphoria in the last couple of months of 1918. So that victory was a catastrophe for democracy. 15 years later, there were almost no democracies left in Europe. The ones that had been created in the aftermath of the First World War to make the world safe for democracy all folded. Because it turned out that the democracies that had won this war had no idea how to win the peace. And in fact, their democratic qualities were what got in the way. Wilson, it turned out, did not speak for the American people. America turned in on itself. Britain, it turned out, didn't want to make the world safe for democracy. The British people wanted to punish the Germans for what they'd done. The French were in no mood to do anything except make themselves more secure. A punitive peace, an isolationist America, meant democracy was worse off as a result of that war than better off. I'm not saying democracy would have been better off to lose it. I'm just saying a war that is won in the name of democracy by democracy is not a marker that democracy in the long term is winning. The other war of which it is true that a war fought for democracy, by democracy, in the name of democracy, with a victory for democracy, was the Iraq War of 2003. Explicitly fought by the United States, and I'm ashamed to say Britain, as a democratic crusade. That war was won decisively on the battlefield, and it was a catastrophe for democracy. Catastrophe in the region, but also a catastrophe for American and British democracy, in both of which systems trust in the system has never recovered from the stories that were told to the peoples of those countries to persuade them that this was a legitimate democratic war. It is not a good test. The war that did make the world safe for democracy was the Second World War. And the Second World War, whatever we might tell ourselves about it now in hindsight, was not a war fought for democracy. It couldn't have been a war fought for democracy because it was won by Stalin, along with the Americans and others. It was a profoundly compromised victory. And because it was a profoundly compromised victory, it required a pragmatic peace. And a pragmatic peace, not a crusading peace, made the world a much safer place for democratic politics. Authoritarianism won that war just as much as democracy did. Stalin was there as the victor, securely in place. Democracy ended up better off as a result. I don't think that war is a good test. And I say this because I think there is a real danger in Ukraine, and I'm not some kind of American realist who wants to say that this war is, America's fault or anything like that. I think Putin is an appalling person. I think the way he's waging this war is morally reprehensible. I think the Ukrainians have every right to defend themselves however they wish, and I think that we should support them. And I think we should hope that they win. But there are many people in the West who think that this war is a symbolic fight to secure the future of democracy against its authoritarian rivals and opponents. That an absolute defeat for Putin, perhaps, as some people say, by not just reclaiming the territory that he's claimed in Ukraine in this war, but by taking back Crimea as well, to show the world that democracy will win and tyrants never triumph and authoritarianism is weak. We need the symbolic value of that victory, is incredibly dangerous. Because symbolic victories in war do not necessarily translate into actual benefits. You just don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's not hard to imagine a scenario in which emphasizing the symbolic value of a victory for European values in Ukraine as a kind of proxy in a global struggle, not just against Russia, but as a kind of marker to the Chinese over Taiwan. That kind of mindset produces a more, not a less dangerous world. A destabilized Russia, a more belligerent China. I'm not arguing for hyperrealism, but I do think the historical record suggests that we have a psychological tendency to mistake symbolic victories for real ones. But I also think that all of this way of thinking about politics, which is we want to know the moment in time where we can check the score and see if our side is winning, indeed, we want to know whether our side has won, misunderstands political time, because political time doesn't work like that. Political time flows. It's relatively seamless. These are entirely arbitrary and artificial breakpoints. I mean, American presidential elections happen on the same day in the same month every 4 years. There is no reason to suppose that political time operates so that on the same day in the same month every 4 years, that's when you should take the score. But more than that, this way of thinking about political time is as units of contest. 4 years, who won, who lost. The duration of the war, who won and who lost. Whereas I would tend to think that political time is more cumulative than that. It's more incremental than that. And it's more like a tide than that. It flows in and out. The stories that we tell about politics do not have these breakpoints in them, but they flow backwards and forwards. They move back, they move forwards again, they move back. There is a direction of travel, but there is not a moment in time where we can take the score. And I want to give a few examples of this, but before I talk about the two main ones, which I'll do for the second half of this lecture, if you think about the last 2 to 3 years of politics, including that period where I've said authoritarianism by our measures is losing, the most significant thing that has happened in the world is not any election, and nor actually do I think, probably in the long run, is it the war in Ukraine. It is the COVID pandemic. We don't know, I think, the long-term political and economic consequences of the COVID pandemic. We're beginning to see little glimmerings of it. It's a tougher world than it was. It's also a world where money is in shorter supply than it was. But also, there's inflation. But if you think about the question of what has that story done for authoritarianism, the simple fact is that during the COVID pandemic, the world became a much more authoritarian place. Because the authoritarian regimes behaved in an authoritarian manner. Just look at China today. But the democratic regimes also behaved in a more authoritarian manner. So I come from a country, I don't know exactly how it was here in the Netherlands, but I come from a country, the UK, where our Prime Minister, who was then Boris Johnson, we've had a few, but it was then Boris Johnson, decided entirely arbitrarily, without even, except in hindsight, any sanction from Parliament, to keep us in our homes, tell us about where we could move to, stipulate a distance from which we could approach other human beings, banned us from attending weddings, banned us from attending funerals, told people that they couldn't go into hospital to visit relatives who were dying. I mean, these are the hallmarks of an authoritarian regime, and there was very little recourse against it. And as the pandemic has faded, so those measures have faded away. Some of them, but not all of them. So there are still laws on the statute book of the British Parliament that actually empower governments to do equally authoritarian things the next time such a crisis arises, and there has been no attempt so far to repeal those laws. The question, it seems to me, is not taken at a particular point in time who is winning and who is losing. The question is, what sticks and what falls back? So as the authoritarian tide swept through the world for about 18 months, and now it recedes and it pulls back in all the countries that are lifting these measures, allowing people the freedoms that they took away. Does it all recede, or does some of it stay? And that seems to me a better measure of the long-term trends than elections or wars. But there is no point in time when you can answer that question. The only answer to it is over time. And I think we don't know yet. I think we don't know yet what the long-term effects of COVID have been on liberal democratic forms of government in the Western world. And it could be, in 10, 15 years' time, that we recognize some of the seeds of the damage was done in the last 2 years. But I want to talk about two other challenges. I'll just spend 10 or so minutes on each, and then I'll try and offer something more cheerful at the end. So the two main challenges that the world faces, I would say, I mean, we can argue about this, but the two main challenges for the next generation, 2 generations, remainder of this century, are the challenge, the opportunity, but also the threat of technological transformation, so the digital revolution, its consequences, including its consequences for democracy, and climate change. The fact that the world is getting hotter and all of the consequences of that. Now, if you ask, is authoritarianism winning? Is democracy coping better with these challenges? Who's up, who's down? We can't take a snapshot. You can't say, well, look, we'll know the answer to that on a day in November in 2024 when we discover if Ron DeSantis is president or not. You need to think long term, and you need to think in terms of incremental cumulative effects, trends, and the possibility that things move backwards and forwards. So with technology, you will be aware, and some of you will be too young to remember this, but I certainly remember it, that at the dawn of the digital revolution, particularly in the second half of the 1990s, from about 1994 till the dot-com bubble burst at the end of that decade, there was widespread optimism that digital technology was inherently good for democracy and inherently bad for authoritarian or autocratic forms of government. It turns out not to be true. That turns out to have been wishful thinking. So the question is why? Why did it turn out that this, what looked like this kind of open, dynamic form of communication, did not suit open and dynamic forms of politics, and instead seems, at least in part, to suit closed regimes, closed, authoritarian, autocratic regimes? So there are a few answers, and I'm going to suggest a few. Why has democracy not been the winner from the digital revolution? So one reason is this, and this is a long-term perspective. This is not a snapshot perspective. The promise and the threat of digital technology for politics, I think, are mirror images of each other. So the promise for democracy is that this technology allows citizens to monitor their governments, to hold them to account, to access information, to see when something's going wrong. It opens up government to citizen surveillance. And this was the hope, that this technology would allow us to learn so much more about what they do so that we can tell them what we want them to do. The secrecy of government would be exploded. The hidden nooks and crannies where the bad stuff happens will be brought to light. The bad actors would be held to account by us, because for the first time in human history, we would have as much access to information as they do. If the whole world's knowledge could be made available through Google or whatever it is, we could use that to enhance the cause of citizen accountability. We could watch them. The risk was that they could watch us. So the mirror image of that, the threat, was that governments now had a technology that allowed them to penetrate our lives much more closely, much more deeply than was ever possible before. They could know all sorts of things about us that they didn't know before. They could keep an eye on us. They could regulate the kinds of information that we might have access to. They could try and manipulate information in order to steer us in certain directions. So we could try and control them. They could try and control us. That, in a way, is the contest. It's not a contest between saviors of democracy and enemies of democracy. It's a kind of contest between two ways of viewing the world. And I think there is sufficient evidence now to see that that is not an equal contest. That states have a huge advantage over us in the game of who's watching whom. Because it's really hard work. So there was probably too much optimism at the beginning of the digital age in thinking that this is what people would want to do with their time, right? The world's information being made available to ordinary citizens would incentivize ordinary citizens to scrutinize their governments. But when you look back on it in hindsight, who on earth thought that was true? It's hard enough to persuade people to take an interest in politics in the first place. Never mind devote hours of their time to looking through documents that previously were not available to them in order to see whether their, say, local officials are delivering the transport system that they wanted or whether they could be held more to account. For us, digital technology has tended to fragment our attention because of the way that our brains work. We tend, on the whole, to move in this age of digital technology to more and more instantaneous judgments. As it were, our political news cycle for us, citizens, works at an incredibly fast speed. Things come and go, scandals blow up. That's what grabs our attention. States, meanwhile, do have the capacity to do the heavy lifting of surveillance because states are built for that. So one of my favorite philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, who wrote a book called Leviathan, which in some ways is a model both of the possibility of successful politics, but also of the potential nightmare of the surveillance state, understood that the basic difference between the people who live under states and states themselves is that we have to sleep and they never do. So the state never sleeps. So his image for the state, one of the ideas he drew on, was an ancient Greek myth of the Argos Panoptes, which is the creature with 1,000 eyes, so that when these eyes are asleep, these eyes are open, and when these eyes are asleep, these eyes are open. So the Argos Panoptes is always watching, which is where the word panopticon comes from. And panopticon was Edward Snowden's nickname for the NSA. It's not all seeing, but it's never not seeing. We hardly ever are paying attention. They always are. And in that imbalance, there is a tendency to favor those regimes that make it a priority to pay attention, which tend to be the authoritarian ones, because that's how they learn what their populations are up to. So one of the reasons that authoritarian regimes really take an interest in what people are doing on social media, more than the people on social media take an interest in what the authoritarian regimes are doing, is because authoritarian regimes cannot test public opinion any other way because they don't have elections. And in that world, the tendency of this technology is to suit and to favor the regimes that never sleep and never want to miss a trick. This technology favors that kind of politics against that 1990s dream of a kind of open, citizenship-based accountability. The second reason is I think in the 1990s there was an assumption that democratic politics was experimental and dynamic and open to new ideas. And so was Silicon Valley. So the early Silicon Valley looked like this kind of dynamic, experimental place. And the most exciting ideas that were coming out in how to use this technology looked like they suited a kind of American liberal democratic mindset. That is, a world in which the market operated, but also people were free to say what they thought and try crazy things without the state interfering. And there seemed to be a kind of symbiosis between the innovative experimental quality of life online and the innovative experimental quality of democratic politics, where ideas are constantly being tested, promoted to citizens, citizens get a chance to reject them, they have to be redrawn. These two things seem to go together. And again, I think that misunderstood what was really going on. So that was, to put it crudely, to misunderstand the surface activity that took place on the platforms that were built with the long-term investment that allowed those platforms and indeed the internet itself to be created in the first place. Because with historical hindsight, we can see that two things go on in a technology revolution. The second thing that happens is dynamic, experimental, market-based innovation. Facebook is created. The first thing that happens is someone builds the hardware, and someone invests unfathomable amounts of government money in the kinds of technological experimentation, most of which will fail, but some of which will succeed. The second of those two things seems to suit democratic regimes. The first of those things usually comes out of authoritarian forms of politics. And the two pieces of evidence I'd offer for that are, in the case of the United States, the initial investment that created the internet on which entrepreneurs were able to build their experimental platforms came out of the military-industrial complex during the Cold War. It was unaccountable government spending. Much of that money was wasted. There was very, very little oversight or accountability anywhere in the system. The sums involved were vast. They were driven by security-based paranoia in a Cold War context. It was the American state in its authoritarian, defensive, security-minded crouch that splurged money at this technology, as a result of which something was created which then suited this innovative, more experimental form of communication. But without the first, you don't get the second. And if you look at the world now, the state that is doing the first is China. So China, in its authoritarian, defensive, I think still, security-minded crouch, is vastly outspending the United States on the next technology revolution, which may well be the AI revolution. But it is also vastly more powerful than the United States in supplying the raw materials, many of them sourced from Africa, which is building the technology of the future. The hardware spending comes from authoritarian modes of politics. The software innovation might well come out of Silicon Valley, but in a world of hardware versus software, it still looks like it might be that hardware comes out on top. And then the last reason, again, that the hopes of the 1990s that this would suit democracy, I think, have turned out to be unfounded, is that there was also a belief that it would democratize the workplace, that this technology would surely create corporations and businesses where workers were empowered to hold their bosses to account. That hasn't happened either. It's happened in some places, in small pockets, but the trend of corporate life, including in the United States, but particularly the trend of the corporations that are actually responsible for these platforms, is towards in their internal organization, is towards autocracy and authoritarianism. They are basically run by tyrants. So Elon Musk is a tyrant. You just look at what he's doing in Twitter. I'm genuinely actually not making a kind of value judgment when I say that, because he's quite good at being a tyrant. He's a very effective tyrant. He's turned Tesla, for now, into the biggest company, or one of the biggest companies in the world, by a ruthless, tyrannical approach. There's nothing democratic about the way that Musk runs his companies. And he stuffs the boards of his companies with family members and friends. I mean, it is like a classic, old-fashioned autocratic regime. There's nothing democratic about the way that what was called Facebook and now is called Meta is run. Mark Zuckerberg cannot lose governing control of that company by its terms of incorporation. He is guaranteed a veto over anything that happens there. I was told once by someone who worked at Facebook that there are only 2 rules for any new product. This amazing, innovative company that experiments every day with new products. There are only 2 rules that really matter in deciding whether this product will fly or not. The first rule is, will it lead people to spend more time on the platform? And the second rule is, will Mark like it? That is not a democratic form of corporate governance. Now, it's possible that these companies, in the end, are going to be undone by the market. So Musk, Tesla's value has halved in the last few months. Mark Zuckerberg, because he runs the show himself, seems to be squandering his and other people's fortune on the metaverse without any checks, anyone able to say to him, are you sure this is a good idea, Mark? He's about 2/3 poorer than he was at the start of the year. He's still pretty rich. So maybe the market will test them out, but for now, the only force that is actually challenging this way of running tech corporations is the Chinese state, which has started jailing these people and breaking up their companies. This kind of corporate governance seems to meet its match in authoritarian and not democratic regimes. It may be that the market will sort these people out. Apple is still doing pretty well, and Apple is doing pretty well despite the fact that Steve Jobs, who was also another tyrant, is long gone, and it is being run in a much more conventional corporate manner. So I don't know the answer to this, but the thought 30 years ago that what we'd see in these tech companies is an explosion of kind of worker-led democracy was a fantasy. The direction of travel is not towards democratic advantage. The second one, again, I'm doing this quite briefly, but I hope you get the sense of it. The second one is climate change. So climate change is not a contest. It's not, you can't say of climate change at any given moment in time who's winning. I mean, is the planet winning? Are we winning? Are the fossil fuel companies winning? Are the Chinese winning? I don't think it makes sense. We want to see it like that, so we want to see Joe Biden doing slightly better than expected in the midterms as the saving of the planet. When Obama got elected, he said, now I've been elected, the oceans are going to stop rising. I mean, it was just nonsense. It's not a contest, it's a predicament. And it's a predicament that exists over time. So if you break climate change down into, we want to know at any given moment whether we're winning, you don't understand what it is that you're dealing with. It's a predicament. Is it a predicament that, seen over the long run, favors democracy over authoritarianism? My feeling, and I don't say this with any pleasure, is it doesn't. So one reason that it doesn't is there aren't many things we know for sure about the medium to long-term effects of a warming planet, but one of them is that it is unquestionably going to lead to more movement of peoples, more migration. And there are different estimates as to how much, but people will move from less habitable to more habitable regions. It's inevitable. I can't see any scenario in which that can be arrested. And we know from historical evidence that migration is one of the drivers of a turn to authoritarianism. And we've seen it in Western politics over the last 10 or 15 years. It is perhaps, in some respects, the single strongest driver of that. Climate change is not going to lessen that impulse. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that when we think about the climate, we often think about the worst case scenarios in terms of the possibility of feedback loops in the ecosystem. So you'll be aware that you can map the trend of the broad direction of travel for temperature rises relative to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. But some of the uncertainty comes from the thought that somewhere within the system, the ecosystem, there might be tipping points. There might be points at which a certain effect triggers a whole range of other effects. Methane being released in Siberia sets off a melting of the ice caps, which means that less sunlight can be captured. And suddenly, things move much quicker. It accelerates very quickly. So there's also the possibility of feedback loops in the relationship between climate change and politics. Climate change might produce more authoritarian politics. More authoritarian politics might be less well equipped to deal with climate change. Climate change might produce more authoritarian politics. That's at least a possibility that there could be a rapid acceleration. Some dystopian fiction speculates on this, that actually what we're looking at is the possibility of quite quickly climate change triggering a series of political effects over which democracies can no longer exercise control. So I don't think there's anything inevitable about that. But the question that you have to ask is, looking long term, what are the things that tend to reinforce the hold and legitimacy of democratic politics? And how likely are we to see more of them? Again, the historical evidence suggests that the single strongest driver of strong democracies that are held to be legitimate by their citizens is economic growth. So there's quite a lot of work that's been done that tracks the relationship between economic growth and, broadly speaking, stable, liberal, social democratic political regimes. And declines in economic growth and instability in those regimes and the rise of authoritarian alternatives. Now, there may be a future for the planet in which the kind of economic growth that was seen in the 20th century that drove the success of democracy is replicated in the 21st, but it must be likely that that is not actually possible or sustainable. And if it's not possible or sustainable, we need to be aware that we have pulled out one of the central planks of democratic legitimacy. So we're going to have to replace it with something else. That's at least a possibility. Something else that drives democratic legitimacy is shared sacrifice. So democracies do tend to emerge from the wars that they fought more coherent and more united when they are victorious. It doesn't mean that they're therefore well equipped to spread democracy around the world. They're not. But welfare states are the products of the First World War and the Second World War. So too was expansion of the franchise and the entrenching of certain democratic rights and liberties come out of a sense of shared sacrifice. If everybody has shared in this ordeal, everybody needs some return. So then the question that has to be asked, is climate change likely to replicate those conditions of shared sacrifice? I think not. I think from what we've seen, climate change tends to produce unequal sacrifice. It's not like fighting a war. It's nothing like fighting a war. Al Gore used to say, we won the Second World War so we can win this battle. The classic way of thinking about it as a contest. It's nothing like the Second World War. It has vastly unequal effects on vastly different populations, peoples, individuals. It's not predictable, and there is no common enemy. Shared sacrifice seems to me unlikely to be one of the drivers of our response to climate change. It's more likely to be divisive than unifying. I don't know, of course. I mean, I don't know any of this, but it's a guess. And the last thing, this is the last gloomy thing I'll say, and then I'll say a few less gloomy things. The last gloomy thing I'll say is that in democracies at the moment, the central tension and divide, I would say, there are two. One is between graduates and non-graduates, which tends to be driving political trends around the democratic world and divides. But the other, probably even more acute, is generational. Older versus younger citizens, older versus younger voters. And one of the markers of this divide is different attitudes to action on climate change. So polling evidence suggests when people under 30 and people over 65 are asked to rank what is the most important thing that their government should do, the under 30s tend to put climate top, and the over 65s don't. And sometimes this is explained, and I think this is not a good explanation, by the idea that older people, so I'm thinking of myself as old here, I'm 55, so old people like me aren't going to be around for long, so we don't care so much about what happens to the planet as people who are young enough that they're likely to live with the worst consequences of climate change. I don't think there's any reason for thinking that's true. I don't think there's any reason for thinking that older voters don't care about what happens after they die. They have children, they have grandchildren, but the best evidence for that is what tends to come top in these polls, alongside climate for younger people is education, and what tends to come top for older people is also education. So older voters tend to say the most important thing they want their government to do is invest in education. Well, they're not saying that because they're all about to go back to university or to school. It must be because they believe in the future. So that can't be the explanation. I think the explanation is more likely that the older you are, and I am old, the older you are, the harder it is to think about radical lifestyle change, which is possible that climate change will require. Giving up your car, changing the way that you live, that you heat your home, that you move around, adjusting yourself to a world of lower economic growth, sacrificing certain basic expectations of progress. It's harder to do that when you're old than when you're young. It's not a sort of failing, it's not culpable. I know it myself, it's harder. In Cambridge, the town where I live, the council has just basically made it really hard to drive around the city in the hope of getting cars off the road, built all sorts of cycle lanes. They're going to introduce a congestion charge. And they've done it in such a way as to make it really hard to move around the city in a car. Now I know, with the part of my brain that can think straight, that we shouldn't be driving around a city like Cambridge. I shouldn't be driving around a city like Cambridge. And this part of my brain is so angry about this that I can't think about anything else. And I want them all voted out of office, the cycle lanes ripped up so I can drive my son to football. We're human, right? We have sunk too much into the way that we live. We are too used to our conveniences. That divide is real. It doesn't mean that older people, because they're not that fussed about some of these changes, are more authoritarian. So it is true that older voters were more likely to vote for Trump or Brexit than younger voters. So in that sense, you might say older voters incline more towards the authoritarian end of the spectrum. Before we came here, we were talking about this at dinner, that the three markers of whether people were likely to vote for Brexit. Number 3 was, did you or didn't you go to university? Number 2 was, how old are you? If you're over 65, you're overwhelmingly likely to have voted for Brexit. If you're under 30, you're overwhelmingly likely to have voted Remain. But the number 1 test was, do you favour the return of capital punishment, of executing criminals? That's the single strongest correlation with a Brexit vote. And that is sometimes described as the authoritarian personality. So yes, maybe, but actually the other polling evidence is that older people when asked, have more faith in democracy, are more likely to vote and favour it over rival systems of government. It's younger voters, so there was a survey in Britain recently that asked people under the age of, I think it was 24, would you favour a strong leader who bypassed Parliament and the rule of law to get things done? It's quite a good definition of authoritarianism. Over 50% said yes. So younger voters are not themselves authoritarian, but they are seriously pissed off with democratic politics, because older voters who vote in greater numbers, of whom there are more in elderly societies, and who do not have young people's perspectives in their, at the front of their minds, are not always, but predominantly determining the direction of travel. So this is a kind of double attack, and climate is an example of this. Older people do not vote for action on climate change, which leads younger people to think that democracy can't solve it. And that is a threat. Right, I've got sort of 5 minutes to go. I still think democracy is the best system of government, not bar all the others. I still think democratic politics is where I want to live. I don't want to live in an authoritarian regime, and nor I think do most people. And I think democracy still has two crucial advantages over authoritarian and autocratic regimes. Democracy's first advantage is that if you think about where do you want to be when something really goes wrong, for instance, in a mass pandemic, would you rather be in an authoritarian regime or a democratic regime? I think most of us, not just those of us who are lucky enough to live in democracies, would recognize that the advantage of being in a democracy when really bad stuff happens is democratic regimes are better at admitting their mistakes. Indeed, the ones who make bad mistakes, we can turf out of office and replace them with other people. They're better at admitting their mistakes, they're better at trying new things, and they are more likely to hear you when you say, this new policy, this ruthless autocratic policy of locking us all in our homes, is actually a threat to me personally. So in China, whatever you think about their zero COVID policy, some people were locked in their homes and died as a result. That does not, on the whole, happen in liberal democracies. There is a way out. I'd still rather live in one of those. The second advantage is that democracies, when things go wrong, can, as the COVID case shows, experiment with forms of authoritarianism to get through the crisis, and then they can pull back. So democracies can turn themselves into more authoritarian regimes, and then they can revert. Overwhelmingly, the historical evidence suggests that when authoritarian regimes try a bit of democracy, democracy sweeps through the system like a virus, which is why authoritarian regimes are incredibly paranoid about letting democracy in. They can't experiment with it. They can't admit their mistakes, zero COVID, and also they can't say, we'll try a bit of democracy here and a bit of democracy here to see if it relieves the pressure, for fear that democracy will simply sweep them away. Democracies are better places to be, and they are better able to change. But still, I think it's a huge challenge when you think about the rest of the 21st century to see these advantages working in the way they did during the 20th century. If the direction of travel, because of the biggest threats that we face, is towards authoritarianism, then I think there's probably less reason to think that authoritarian regimes are going to feel that they ought to try a bit of democracy. I mean, does anyone seriously think that if the Putin regime collapses because of the Ukraine war, what will happen in Russia is an outbreak of democracy, rather than potentially something either more chaotic or more authoritarian than what preceded it? In the 20th century, particularly in the end of the 20th century, it was thought democracy must win, because over time, these autocratic, authoritarian regimes will have to let a bit of democracy in, and then they'll be blown away, whereas we can move back and forth. I think it's more likely in the 21st century that the authoritarian regimes think they don't, and meanwhile, the democratic regimes, as they move back and forth, it's 2 steps back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 1 step forward, and gradually, over time, democratic institutions and values erode. I think that's a possibility. But the last thing I would say is that none of this is determined. Nothing that I've said, I don't know what's going to happen. No one knows what's going to happen. This is merely trying to view this as a broad picture with some, it seems to me, predominant but not entirely dominant trends. But it is a little analogous to climate change itself. So there's often an argument about, you've got to be optimistic. If you talk this kind of gloomy stuff, people will just give up. I just don't think that that's true. So with climate change, on the one hand, there is a view where we measure it as a contest, which is 2030, 1.5 degrees. That's our target. That's what we have to achieve. If we don't manage that, we're screwed. It's a kind of all or nothing. Here's this thing that we've committed to. Well, we're not going to do it. It's just not going to happen. I think the consensus among most scientists is that we have a rough idea of the shape of what we're looking at with climate change. Unless there are these unexpected feedback loop effects, we're going to go past 1.5 degrees. But we are probably going to stop short of 3 degrees because of the advances we're making with technology, renewables, and some of the ways in which we organize energy. And there are reasons to be optimistic that the worst case scenarios are not going to happen. And there are reasons to be pessimistic that our target is not going to be met. So we're probably looking at a world in 50 years' time that's somewhere between 1.8 and 3 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. So on the one hand, that's pretty gloomy. On the other hand, there is all the difference in the world between 1.8 and 3. There's like everything to fight for and to play for in trying to move it towards the better end of that. This is a world that will be, for the most part, worse than the world that we currently live in. But how much worse depends on us. You could say we still need to stick to 1.5 and have that fight and judge people by what they do in relation to pledges that were made and then are going to be measured at the next unit of account in time. You might do that, and while you're doing that, the real battle, which is to pull it closer to the less bad end of that spectrum, is being dissipated by this other futile struggle. So I think the analogy with democracy is, I think the 21st century inclines towards authoritarianism, globally and indeed potentially within Western liberal democratic societies. But there's a huge difference between very, somewhat, marginally more authoritarian. I think an authoritarian world is worse than a democratic world, in the same way that I think a much warmer world is worse than the world we live in now because of some of the effects that it creates. But there is all the difference in the world between fighting for a marginally more authoritarian world in which certain kinds of democracy are still robust and dynamic and capable of defending themselves, and a considerably more authoritarian world in which democracy is weak and attenuated and doesn't provide the protection that we want. And if we spend our time thinking about democracy is going to be saved or destroyed by whether Trump wins in 2024, and this person, Obama, is its savior, and this person is its destroyer, and everything hangs on the next election and the next election, or even that everything hangs on the outcome of the Ukraine war, if we think that we want to know at a given moment in time whether or not we're winning or losing, we will lose. Whereas if we accept realistically that the direction of travel is against us, because I think it is, then we have a chance of mounting a rearguard action that has a serious possibility of success, because we will be defending something that has no automatic right to survive and has disadvantages in the 21st century, and we will actually think it's worth fighting for. But if all we think about is who's going to win the next election, we will be too busy doing that, and then the authoritarians will win. Thank you.
David, I will speak up a bit for a nice lecture.
You keep it close to the
Is it?
Yes, it is.
It is working, okay.
Close to your mouth, please.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? I think it was a clear lecture, though.
So depressing that no one's got anything to say.
Yes, here's a question.
Thank you for the lecture. It was really insightful. But the question I would have is, what makes you believe that the democratic regimes are better at admitting mistakes? Because I don't think they are. And during COVID, it was pretty clear that the democratic movements were not willing to even consider that their policies are a mistake. It was anathema to suggest that. During, for example, New Labour administration, you may be more familiar than most of us with, the policies, the media policy of the government was basically to keep the government up in the post at all costs, even by not admitting mistakes, avoiding playing the media at all costs. So I don't really think that the regimes are better at admitting mistakes, because admitting mistakes loses you percentage points and loses you elections.
Yeah. So I'd say there are two reasons. So Tocqueville, who's another philosopher, historic philosopher I've always liked and admired, so when he wrote about democracy in America, and he said he thought that the direction of travel in the world was towards democracy, but also then ultimately towards the authoritarian version of democracy. But in the dynamic phase of democracy, he thought democracy's great advantage was democracies make many more mistakes than autocratic regimes, and they correct many more mistakes than autocratic regimes. So it depends how you measure it. So by volume of mistake, democracies are constantly screwing up. I mean, policy making in democratic regimes is chaotic. It's very short-termist on the whole, not exclusively, but mainly short-termist. It's subject to relentless political pressure. In many systems like the American system, there's no time to make policy because you're too busy raising money. Some of it is almost random, and there is a classic understanding of democracy that it is just random politics. The classic version of democracy, which is anyone can do it. It doesn't matter, you just take it in turns. This person could do it, they might be competent, this person could do it, they might be incompetent. But the point is, you keep rotating through. Democracies make more mistakes, but the mistakes are much, much more visible. That is, they're more easily brought to the surface, they're more easily discussed. And that there is a remedy as well, which is the one that you said, they're so busy worrying about being elected that they don't admit their mistakes. But actually, I think the evidence is the ones who don't admit their mistakes get voted out. Now, it's a sort of fine balance. Politicians hate saying, I got it wrong. They hate changing their mind. But a long-term mistake is fatal. So I think British politics is quite a good example of this at the moment. I mean, the good thing about British politics is we have a clear, unequivocal, no one disputes this, and not a single person in Britain who disputes this, that Liz Truss, who was our Prime Minister for 20 minutes, during those 20 minutes made a catastrophic mistake, which was the financial measures she and the Finance Minister Kwasi Kwarteng announced, which essentially offered unfunded tax cuts. At the same time, she thought there were two things she had to do. The one was the thing that she was elected to do by the members of her party, which was to cut taxes. The other thing was the thing that she had to do to win the next election, which was to pay people's fuel bills, because fuel prices were going up catastrophically high. So she committed to paying the fuel bills to win the next election, and then she offered her party what it needed, which was tax cuts. And it turned out that you can't do that because the sums don't add up, and it completely spooked the markets. So now we've got a new government, same party, that has admitted that it wasn't great, but has tried to say that it was well-intentioned. She meant well. She believed in paying people's fuel bills and lowering their taxes. I mean, which is nice. It's like, who doesn't like that? But it doesn't really want to own it as a mistake, and has also tried to say it wasn't our mistake, it was her mistake. The chances are that that party, the Conservative Party, will not be forgiven for this. That mistake, which was corrected very quickly. I mean, the other extraordinary thing about it is that she was only Prime Minister for 7 weeks, because the Conservative Party wants to win the next election, and they spotted within about 24 hours that their new Prime Minister had to go. Unbelievably ruthless. I mean, the opposite of what happens in autocratic and authoritarian regimes, where if Xi Jinping makes a mistake on that scale, he's not going to be gone in 24 hours, right? They will dig in. I mean, in a way, I think with zero COVID, he probably did make a mistake on that scale, because it's now really dangerous and economically dangerous. So I think they do bring the mistakes to the surface, admit them, but they do make more of them. And it's a sort of balance of risk question. Do you want to be in a regime that screws up more but knows when it's screwed up? Or do you want to be in a regime that screws up less but won't admit it? And on that balance, it's not absolute. I mean, democracies have done some pretty terrible things. I mean, really terrible things. I still think the balance favors democracy. But it is a balance of risk question. It's not a... mistakes get corrected in democracies and they don't get corrected in authoritarian regimes.
Okay, next question here in the middle.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I would just like to hear your opinion on the fact that, on the idea that social media, that the effective usage of propaganda from these authoritarian states in social media is propagating the idea that authoritarian states are a more effective or more elegant or more attractive solution to today's problems, and that the openness of government is working against the interest of maintaining an anti-authoritarian regime.
Yeah. So I don't think that the way that authoritarian regimes say, I mean, using China as an example, it doesn't have to be China, the way authoritarian regimes use this technology and control it, or the way that the Russian regime does, is an attractive model of how to do it. So one of the really, I think, striking features of Western democratic politics at the moment is that there's great dissatisfaction with our politicians and our political systems, particularly among young people. There's a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, but there's very little sense that we want to do it like the Chinese. So I remember I did an event a few years ago with a man called Seamus Milne, who was Jeremy Corbyn's sort of chief advisor and strategist. And he gave this kind of scathing indictment of Western liberal democratic capitalism to a middle-class audience in Cambridge, sort of packed room of people hanging on his every word. And he said, you know, this system is unequal, it's unfair, it's corrupt. You know, our politicians don't know what they're doing, they keep making mistakes, they won't admit them, the Tories keep winning, blah, blah, blah. You know, we've got to change it. And someone said, well, we all completely agree with you. How do you want to change it? And he says, we should run our societies like the Chinese run theirs. And every single person in the room looked horrified. In a way, it's not, I think, that what we risk in the West is that people look at the way that China uses technology to broadcast more coherent messages or propaganda, to regulate freedom of expression, to prioritize social coherence over various kinds of social experimentation. And we in the West think, yeah, that's what we want. I don't think that's the challenge. I don't think it's that kind of contest. I don't think it is. So I've tried deliberately in that lecture to avoid saying it's America versus China. I don't think it is. But I think the underlying structures of how we do politics now mean that those kind of regimes are potentially more robust than they seemed to be 20 or 30 years ago, and ours are potentially less robust. So personally, I would still rather live in a world where people can use social media to voice all of their angers and frustrations. I think it's better, I think it's more attractive, but it's probably not great for our democracy. And partly because there are no controls over the way that this information spreads through the system. To engineer those controls is somewhat more authoritarian. And that probably is the trade-off. But I don't think it's that we look at, I think you used a phrase like elegant. I don't think we look at the way that it happens under authoritarian regimes and feel a kind of envy for it. I mean, I may be wrong, and I may have misunderstood, you know, what TikTok has done to the imagination of the world. But again, I don't think most people who use TikTok think of it as a Chinese platform. I mean, I think they think of it as TikTok. It may be brilliant under the radar propaganda, but I don't think it is. I think it's more that there are structural forces at work in the politics of the 21st century which have upended the balance of risk that we'd got too comfortable with at the end of the 20th, which is that the strengths of democracy work in this set of conditions. But I don't think it's a question of us choosing their way of doing it.
Thank you. Oh, that's another
Looking
question.
out for the question, yes.
Well, I want to ask at first, well, China has grown economically very strong, yes. And you said to grow economically, it's a great chance to get more democratic. But in fact, China, at first, people thought China will be democratic, but then it changed and it becomes autocratic again. So how you explain this?
I don't think I was clear. What I was saying was a more specific point the other way around, which is where a regime is democratic, economic growth will underpin the success of that regime. It doesn't follow that where there is economic growth, a regime that is not democratic will transition to democracy. That was the belief at the end of the 20th century, that a growing middle class, a kind of an almost 18th century faith in progress, that a growing liberal middle class inevitably means eventually the demand for democracy will become so strong that the regime will be unable to resist it. That hasn't happened. So in a way, I'm making a much more banal point, which is the regime that you have is likely to be reinforced by economic growth. So the Chinese regime has certainly been reinforced by its success. The big question is what happens to the Chinese regime when economic growth fails. And I still think that democracies have the advantage. You know, when an economic crisis comes, they do become more authoritarian. I mean, we saw it in the financial crisis, right? They will nationalize banks overnight. George Bush will bypass Congress because Congress won't vote for the bailout, so he'll just do it anyway. Gordon Brown, then the British Prime Minister, says, we have to save the world and it's a Sunday, so we can't reconvene Parliament. But luckily we can do it because I'm Prime Minister, I kind of can do what I like. So they can do that. I don't think there will at some point in the next 10, 15, 20 years be a serious economic challenge in China because you can't just keep growing. And it may be coming sooner than that. The hope 20, 30 years ago is that's the point where democracy will kind of find its way into the system. I think as the world looks now, that looks more wishful than it did then. I think it's as likely, if not more likely, that the regime tightens and has the capacity, thanks to this technology, to tighten, than that it says, like, you know, the Tsarist regime during the First World War, we give up, you middle-class liberals have a go, and then the middle-class liberals give up and the Bolsheviks take over. I don't think it's going to work like that. But it's not that growth produces democracy, it's that growth stabilizes the regime you have. So I'm sorry I wasn't clear.
Maybe a last question.
Thank you for your very interesting lecture. I was wondering about the phenomenon of polarization. You mentioned it a little bit, but you almost depicted it as generations, young versus the old or something like that. I don't think that's very credible. And also you said the first predictor of the Brexit was whether you are for or against death penalty. So that has nothing to do with generations, apparently.
Oh, yes,
so
it does.
I'm not sure about that, but you mentioned it as a separate course of generations at least. So, but anyhow, I'm not going to discuss that. But the polarization, I think, is a very interesting phenomena and also a very dangerous phenomenon for democracy. And I wonder whether you also think it's a dangerous phenomenon and how we should cope with that.
Yeah, so if I can say just a couple of things on that. So I mean, I know you weren't trying to ask me about the age thing, and again, I have to be clear what I'm saying here. I mean, a lot of these things are correlated. So for instance, the older you are, so I know the UK case best. So the older someone is, say someone is over the age of 70 in the UK, there's about a 1 in 20 chance that that person went to university, because university enrollment was very low until the 1980s in the UK, very low. Among the under 30s, it's higher than a 50% chance. So then the question is, if there's this huge divergence in how the over 70s and the under 30s vote, is it because they're over 70, or is it actually the educational thing that's driving it? Likewise, if you poll people on the return of the death penalty, those over 70 are much, much more likely to favour it than those under 30. So correlation is not causation. I'm not saying because they're old, this follows from it. But nonetheless, this divide is real, and it is growing in most democratic societies. And one of the reasons I think it's growing, and the reason I think it matters, is one of the forces that we're dealing with here is demography, right? We just are much older societies. We're much more elderly. The median age in various places in Europe is approaching 50 now. The median age in Japan is above 50. Traditionally, the view was the voters were predominantly young, and their representatives were old. So young people could win elections if they wanted to, because there were many more of them. Many more people in their 30s than in their 70s, but many more representatives in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, the representatives are old, the voters are old, the elections go to the old. When Boris Johnson won the UK general election, if you did a map of Britain and only people under 30 could vote, Jeremy Corbyn would have won the biggest landslide in Labour's history. And if only people over 60 could vote in the UK, every seat of the 650 bar 5 would have been won by the Conservatives. So it's two countries. Now, that's not the polarisation we tend to focus on, partly because under our system, there isn't a party of the young and the party of the old. I mean, there is. The Labour Party is the party of the young. But they don't call themselves that. The Conservatives don't call themselves the old party or the party of the oldies. But they are. So one of the issues with us is that our polarisation cuts across some of the actual sources of our polarisation. That parties, under some proportional systems, there are parties that clearly, in a sense, are the parties of the graduates and so on. But under many systems, it's kind of buried underneath other partisan and polarizing divisions. And the other thing I'd say, the last thing I'd say, which connects to the theme of my lecture, is I think there is a danger. I agree that polarization makes democracy harder. Most people tend to think it makes democracy harder because the stakes are higher and there is an increasing sense that you can't afford to let the other side win. It's much harder to get losers' consent to election results in many systems because there's this fear that somehow they're so different from us. This statistic in America that 40 years ago, 5% of Republicans would not have been happy if one of their children married a Democrat, and now it's 50%. These are the other. It's only, they're all Americans. These are the other. But the other threat of polarization is not that the other side are going to win and destroy democracy, because they're not, right? They're not. The threat is nothing gets done. The threat of polarization is much more paralysis than it is that lot are the enemy of democracy, our lot are the saviors of democracy. The results of the US midterm elections didn't save democracy. There's more of a chance that it was a traditional result. The Republicans now control the House, Democrats control the Senate, a very, very old man is in the White House. It's harder than ever to get anything done. So we could go through these elections where we think, oh my God, the bad person won. Hooray, the good person won. Oh no, the bad person won again. He's going to save it, she's going to destroy it, she's going to save it, he's going to destroy it. We could do that for the next 20 or 30 years. And meanwhile, the things that we have to do don't get done. And there is a real danger, I think, that our preoccupation with the thought that the other side winning is the end of the world misunderstands the problem, which is it's not the end of the world. The end of the world is doing nothing about the looming end of the world.
Wow. Thank you very much for today and also answering all the questions. I think we have a very nice lecture today, and I hope you will join us for a little drink afterwards and we will discuss a bit further. Please give a warm applause for David.
Thank you.
Can you do the logistics?
So best to talk a bit more about what you just heard. There are free drinks in the after if you go out on the back here and to the right at the end of the hall. Free drinks to talk a bit more about the topic of tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.